Well, hello there again. Now it's time for us to move into the second half of the week in the 1960s. And the 60s really began with the Kennedy presidency. And here you see a picture of him and Jackie and one of their children. And I can't remember which one that is, but it's a wonderful look at a relatively young family. I think he was the youngest president, youngest man elected president at that time. I think Clinton may have edged him ever so slightly, or was it Teddy Roosevelt? But anyway, it doesn't matter. Look at him, very young, been a World War II veteran. He's a captain of PT 109. Jackie Bouvier, which will become Jackie Kennedy. His wife is glamorous, and a lot of people refer to this as the age of Camelot. But let's look at the big picture for just a minute here. As we move into 1960, and we've had Eisenhower for 2 terms, and now he has moved out, and it's time for basically a new generation to take over. Ike represented the old generation, whereas Kennedy is going to represent the new. And so that's why I say this as 1960 sees the dawning of a new era. And what you see here is the parents of these baby boomers had reached middle age, and baby boomers were about to reach adolescence. Like I said, my parents graduated high school in '64, just after Kennedy's assassination, and they're first generation baby boomers. So you're seeing a whole new group of people come of age. Now we say, "Hey, boomer," and that's seen as a term of derision, whereas at this time it was a term of being on the cutting edge. And so all of a sudden now, all these people were born in the 20th century, as opposed to being born in the 19th century. That is a nice line of demarcation there. And you see that anxiety of the 50s that we looked at earlier in the week gets transformed into hope. And it's because, like I said, of this one person, Kennedy, and the people that he surrounds himself with. But it's not all butterflies and unicorns. There's going to be social movements bubbling under the surface, and they're going to explode in that second half of the 60s. We've already seen civil rights, and it's going to be sitting there bubbling around for a little while, but they're going to be ready to explode, and they're going to explode in a dramatic way by 68. And the Cold War itself is still there. It didn't go anywhere. It didn't just end, hey, we've got Kennedy around, Cold War's over. No. It doesn't, and it's going to enter the most dangerous phase of all. Let's talk about the election of 1960. Whereas you have Richard Nixon, who was Eisenhower's vice president. He is going to be running against Kennedy. And Nixon, not that much older than Kennedy at all. But instead of being radio debates and things like that, these guys are going to get on television for the first time. And Kennedy is going to, use makeup and things like that in order to look good on television. It doesn't matter how tan you are. It doesn't matter how good you think you look. You get under the bright lights of a TV studio and you're going to look washed out and sick. And so what ends up happening is Kennedy looks like a movie star. I mean, Marilyn Monroe aside, he looks like a movie star. And Richard Nixon, who had been relatively ill prior to that, if I'm not mistaken, it was the flu he had, all of a sudden he looks like death sucking on a lifesaver. And so people that saw it on television swore up and down that Kennedy won the debate, hands down. And people who heard it on the radio said Nixon did. So it kind of shows us the impact of visual imagery, visual imagery on how people perceive, politicians. Still the same thing today. But we have there's a role of television. Oh, this thing that won't click. There we go. But there's also a religion issue with Kennedy. Kennedy was Catholic. And there had been this great fear in America for some crazy reason that a Catholic president would be much more beholden to the Pope in Rome than he would to his own people or his own country. It's insane, but it happened in the election of 28, and it's going to bring itself out here in the election of 60. But Kennedy is incredibly smart, and he had a meeting with Protestant ministers and saying, hey, listen, my thing, I'm about the United States of America, not about the Pope in Rome. And that assuaged a lot of fears. Mitt Romney did the same thing in 2007 when he, as a Mormon, which was not necessarily a mainstream religion in all of the country, which is just crazy we think that way. But anyway, so Romney does sort of the same thing. And he did it on the day my sons were born. It was interesting. I was watching that on TV, and my wife's like, why are you not paying attention? And I'm like, well, got a little something to watch on TV here. But that's going to kind of alleviate this anti-Catholic bias at the time. We saw something very similar with Amy Coney Barrett, when he was just nominated for and took her seat on the Supreme Court, Senator Feinstein from California, he said the dogma lives loudly in you, or something to that effect. And I'm going, I thought we were past this in this country. But anyway, I guess there's a few vestiges still around. So what we have next is the Khrushchev versus Nixon kitchen debates. Oh, yes. So Khrushchev and Nixon get into it. Nixon wants to show he's a hardliner. He's an anti-communist. So he brings the old brawler, Nikita Khrushchev, over, and they get in the White House kitchen, and they have this debate. I think it's kind of like two pigs wrestling in the mud. It's just two guys going at it and trying to chop each other up. But that's Nixon trying to show, I'm the man you want here, not this young guy who hadn't done anything since World War II. And what you end up with is a very, very close vote. And we're going to look at that in just a minute. But what happens is this close vote shows JFK you don't have a mandate to go run wild. Okay? Can't do anything you want. Same thing Joe Biden's running into right now. Your margin of victory is narrow enough, and your electoral vote that process is narrow enough, and the Republicans probably still control the Senate. You're not going to be able to go crazy and do everything you want to. So that's when they're talking about checks and balances, things that kind of happens at the polls if it doesn't, happen in the halls of Washington. But one of the things that Kennedy does is he does get Martin Luther King released from jail. And that's going to set in motion some major civil rights movement that is going to come. And then we're going to look at his New Frontier quote on the next slide. It's part of his inaugural, and I don't know if the image is going to show up. But what happens is Kennedy calls upon the American people for sacrifices to achieve their potential greatness. That's what he's talking about, this new frontier. And I want you to look at this piece from his address. He says, we stand today on the edge of a new frontier. The frontier of the 1960s, a frontier of unknown opportunities and paths, a frontier of unfulfilled hopes and threats. The new frontier I speak of, I should say of here, is not a set of promises, is a set of challenges. Pretty good. All right. And then it does ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And which is going to go down as probably the most famous saying of the Kennedy administration. Kennedy's got to deal with some domestic issues. And the first, he's got to put his cabinet and his staff together. And they're going to call them the whiz kids, the best and the brightest. Matter of fact, Dave Halberstam, historian, wrote an incredible book called The Best and the Brightest. And it's going to include people like, oh my goodness, if you've seen the movie Ford versus Ferrari, you'll see not the Lee Iacocca character, but you will see one of them. Lord have mercy, folks. I'm so sorry. I'm messing it up. We'll kick to it here in a minute, and it will jog my memory. This is what happens when you sit down in front of a computer and try to do this. All right? But what happened with what Kennedy's wanted are the best and the brightest, the best and the brightest and the best of the sons of morning, dawn in our darkness and lend us thine aid. I mean, it's almost religious in nature, but he wants the smartest people around him, and that's an incredibly good thing to have. You don't want a bunch of yes men around you. I'm afraid Trump does, and that gets you in a world of trouble. You want the best and the brightest. You want people who will challenge you. You don't want to be the smartest person in the room all the time, and that's what his Whig kids are going to do. Robert McNamara, that's who I'm talking about. Robert J. McNamara had been one of the head honchos at Ford. He's not there at the time of the movie because he's in the Kennedy administration and later in the Johnson administration. All right, so I think he's replaced by Lee Iacocca. Lord, have mercy. But anyway, so here's a few of them. There's Robert McNamara, who has either the coolest or the ugliest part in his hair I have ever seen. Like George Bundy, some of those guys, these are the best and the brightest that America has to offer. Ivy League educated, very accomplished. But that lack of a mandate that you see right here, the states in red are going to be Democrat for Kennedy. And I know that's backwards of the way we look at it today, but whatever. The blue ones are going to be your Republicans or Richard Nixon. And if you look at that, well, Kennedy, he's going to owe a lot of his success to the old states of the Confederacy, with exception part of Alabama and Mississippi and a little bit of Oklahoma. And, look at Mississippi and Alabama, and you see Senator Robert Byrd or Bob Byrd there is going to win the Deep South. So you see some real splits between the South and the Democratic Party. But you start looking at that popular vote, man, oh man, you're looking at like 49% Richard Nixon, 49.7% Kennedy. There's only 0.2% separate them in the popular vote. So this whole popular vote thing's nothing new, man. This is 10 years before I was born. And you look at the electoral vote, it's relatively close. This right here is sort of the same situation that Joe Biden faces today. So if people think it's unparalleled, no, it's not. We've had this several times before. But that lack of a mandate means you're going to have to moderate a little bit. And we see Kennedy's lack of political experience in an executive capacity kind of show itself out with the steel industry fiasco. Steel industry wanted all of these tariffs and this, that, and the other, and they said if they did that, they were not going to strike. And so they kind of bullied Kennedy around a little bit. Kennedy does that. They're going to strike anyway. So it shows Kennedy sometimes you can't trust everybody and take them at their word. So that's kind of a coming of age moment for old JFK. His brother is going to be the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy is, and he's going to lead a crusade against organized crime. To this day, in 2020, my mother still swears up and down that JFK and the LBJ and the mob had Kennedy assassinated. Well, one of the Kennedy's big things that he wanted America to have was to pledge that we would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. So the space program is really going to take off. It's under Kennedy. It started under Eisenhower, but Kennedy's going to accelerate it. And there's a picture of Neil Armstrong on the moon in 69. And he's going to come up with some new frontier programs. We've had New Deal, Square Deal, all this other kind of stuff, Fair Deal. Now we're going to have New Frontier, all right? And these New Frontier, what's popping out there? But the New Frontier is going to have a series of goals. Number one is going to be increased aid to education from the federal government. You go back to Sputnik, and it scared the bejesus out of all of us. And now we want to increase federal aid to education, not just in math and science, but in other areas as well. And to this, now I'm going to tell you, as somebody who is in K-12 education, I would love to have more federal money, but federal money comes with a lot of strings, which is a problem sometimes. He wanted to provide health insurance to the elderly. Now, if you're sitting at home, you're going, we got that today. It's called Medicare. Yes, the genesis of Medicare comes under Kennedy, though he dies before it can be implemented. Then he wanted to help cities with the Department of Urban Affairs and wants to help migrant workers. These are great things right here that Kennedy wants to do. This is part of his new frontier of moving America forward. We're moving into the latter half of the 20th century, not back into the 19th. So what you're looking at is not reaction, but probably progress or progressive or liberal if we use our old political spectrum. However, there are going to be some things that Kennedy does not get done. And one of those is that federal aid to education gets shot down. Urban renewal gets shot down. What became Medicare and Medicaid gets shot down. Cutting taxes gets shot down. This is a problem for JFK. In the early part of his administration, it was not very successful. He's not getting many of his programs through or many of his ideas through, even if he has a Congress that is relatively okay with him. So that just kind of shows you we got this young guy here. On the ticket with him as vice president is Lyndon Johnson, who was known as the master of the Senate. And I'm going to hold off on Lyndon Johnson, but it's interesting. You've got one of the best political machiners, and I know that's not a real word, but I'm going to use it anyway. One of the best political machiners in American history is your vice president. Why is this stuff not working? Well, Kennedy and LBJ do not get along. LBJ sees him as some weird liberal rich boy from the eastern part of America, and he sees LBJ as a country bumpkin. And Lord have mercy, is their relationship tumultuous. But there are some things that Kennedy gets done. And one of those is a raising of the minimum wage. We kind of ballyhoo that today is a great thing, and it probably was at that time, though it's not a panacea, but that's a different story for a different day. He did get some, redevelopment for distressed areas, typically cities, in blighted areas. But his biggest success is going to be the space race because it does take off for America. And we all know that in July of 1969 that we do land the first man on the moon. As a matter of fact, we're the only country to ever put a person on the moon. A lot of times people talk about in the math classes, talk about the metric system. I said, there are countries that have used the metric system, and there's a country that's put a man on the moon. They are not the same. But anyway, Kennedy's going to have some critics. and he has large majorities in the House and the Senate. The question becomes why? And here we go. A good many congressional representatives were elected in 1960 in spite of his, meaning Kennedy's, presence on the ticket rather than because of it, which means they're more worried about getting themselves reelected than they are about doing what Kennedy wants. Kennedy's coattails didn't bring him in. They got him in spite of Kennedy's coattails. That's very important because as we look back from our perch in the 21st century, we think of the Kennedy years as this idyllic age and, oh my goodness, it was so great. And if he just hadn't been assassinated, what you see here, when you start looking at it and digging up under the hood, Kennedy was in a rough place. His reelection would have been hotly contested in 64. Okay? So remember to keep this in mind about why couldn't he get things done. And you go back again, you see how what states he won, what states Nixon won, and that unpledged actually goes to Robert Byrd, but that's okay. So in the meantime, one of the things about Kennedy, and this is something that I really like, he's very Eisenhower-esque in this regard, is that he's pragmatic about the economy. He doesn't mind a minor deficit spending. Today, there's just no telling. I mean, the federal government, how much money they waste. It's like a daggone popcorn machine popping out billions of dollars. But Kennedy's talking about very minor deficit spending. Okay, and he's going to use it to increase two things that he believes are of vast importance. One being defense spending, and we're going to see that in a little bit. Remember, Ike wasn't as generous with the defense budget as some people thought he would be given his background. And the other is going to be space exploration, because this is going to be something that has never been done before. It's going to take billions upon billions of dollars to get a man to the moon, and Kennedy's willing to deficit spend to do it. But he's also in his economics, he is a supply side guy, which makes him almost Republican in many ways. We keep laughing amongst my friends and say if Kennedy was on the ticket today, he'd be a Republican. There's no way the Democrats will let him hang around, which just shows you the weirdness of American politics today. But he says that a rising tide lifts all boats, meaning if we cut taxes on these people here, then all of a sudden they're going to invest that money, create more opportunity. So he's for that. But Congress fears inflation, and they're like, you know what? Nah, we're not going to cut taxes there, big guy. We're not going to do it. Now, remember this when we get to LBJ, because LBJ is going to govern using the mental imagery and the emotions of the dead JFK, and he said this is what President Kennedy would have wanted. So Congress starts cutting taxes later and deficit spending even more. LBJ really feeds that in American history, and so you end up with sort of the mess we're in now. But LBJ is also going to be a great civil rights president, even though he lacks the political capital to make it happen with the tip of a pen. But what's going to happen is that he's going to go along and he's going to become to greatly sympathize with the civil rights movement, and especially with Dr. King. And so when the Freedom Riders go throughout the American South trying to spread this word, and they get attacked and they get stopped by sheriffs and they get beaten and they get firebombed, Kennedy's not, and RFK, his brother, the Attorney General, are not going to sit for this. And they use the Interstate Commerce Commission to put a stop to it. So those buses cross state lines. It's now interstate commerce, which gives the federal government some authority. And there's a picture of one of the Greyhound buses. Can you imagine that? I mean, but when James Meredith's supposed to go to the University of Mississippi and integrate it, he has to send the federal marshals down, to protect him. I mean, it's a crazy, crazy time. And then you go down to, there's James Meredith, and then you go down to Martin Luther King and Bull Connor in Selma, Alabama. If you've not walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and you're in that area, you really need to. It's quite powerful. What you see there is where racism and segregation are really making their death throes, and a new country is being born, the same one that Abraham Lincoln talked about in the Gettysburg Address. That new birth of freedom is going to happen there. So you've got what happens with James Meredith there. You've got Bull Connor versus Martin Luther King in Selma. We'll get to Birmingham later. You got what's happening to the Freedom Riders and how they're using the Interstate Commerce Commission. But you get a guy who shows up and forms his own political party by the name of George Wallace. And George Wallace, in some ways, you won't laugh at it, but you hate to laugh at him knowing how much of a kook that he is, how much of a racist that he is. And George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama, talked about pointy-headed professors and welfare mamas popping out babies like they're a cash crop. And that appeals to a certain segment of the American population at that time. So JFK is having to fight that before his death. So JFK becomes one of these great civil rights icons, though he does not stay in office long enough to really get what the recognition he deserves. Probably one of the greatest civil rights moments of all time is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech in Washington, there at the Lincoln Memorial. Why is he there? There's George Wallace. Why is Martin Luther King there? He's there in support of proposed civil rights legislation. JFK's floated that balloon, and now Martin Luther King's like, we have to go and support it, and hundreds of thousands of people show up. That is a massive level of support, especially in 1963. And so King delivers one of the greatest messages of all time. I mean, look at that background, that backdrop. And if you've ever been to the mall and you've ever stood there on the Lincoln Memorial, which, by the way, there is a little bronze, it's either a star or a circle, where King gave that speech, and you know how many people it would take to fill that up. You know, this is in a pre-COVID area, obviously. I don't see any masks out there. But you look, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. That true meaning of its creed was formed in November 19th, 1863, when Lincoln gave his Gettysburg Address. Now, King here is quoting the Declaration. But what did that Declaration mean? It meant what Lincoln says it meant. But look at how he does. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. And he goes, and I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plains, and the crooked places shall be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. What he's talking about here is let people be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. And it is a powerful, powerful moment. This is when you know that the civil rights movement has reached a maturity that there is going to be action. It's just a matter of when. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. JFK's got to fight the Cold War for a minute. And Eisenhower's crew had been in favor of something they call massive retaliation. That way you don't get triggered into every little stinking fight that goes along. But the whiz kids are going to advocate something called flexible response. It means you don't use a sledgehammer to hit a fly, but it contains a very, very lethal logic. And when you look at this right here, directing that Secretary of Defense, which is going to be Robert McNamara, a former Ford executive, to undertake that reorganization and modernization of the Army structure, the flexibility to meet any direct or indirect threat. Here's the problem. When you have that capability, you tend to want to use it. Eisenhower, back at the end of his administration, said to be wary of the growing influence of the military-industrial complex. You've got people cranking out planes and rockets and bombs and rifles and tanks and guns and everything else you can get your hands on. They want you to keep buying more. The lethal logic here is that we can now do it, whereas you're not going to go to war with the structure that we had for light and transient causes. Now you can, and I think we all know what's going to happen in Vietnam. All right, so we're going to build up regular forces. We're going to build up our special forces. There you go. New tanks, new this, new planes, new the other. And it gets us involved in something called the Bay of Pigs, too. The Bay of Pigs have been planned during the Eisenhower years. And what we got going on there is we don't want Fidel Castro running around Cuba. So we're going to try to overthrow him by taking some Cuban emigres, and we're going to train them up by the CIA, and we're going to invade Cuba. They're going to invade Cuba and run Castro out. And this had not borne any fruit by the time Eisenhower left office, but now it's going to by the time Kennedy's in there. And it becomes, there's the Bay of Pigs right there. Nice. Looks like the lagoon off Gilligan's Island. But you're starting to see, you saw Castro. Now you see these guys here, look at their prisoners. They get captured. It is an absolute zoo, and America looks incredibly stupid. But it also looks like America is willing to invade Cuba to knock. And so that's going to create a problem because the Cubans are going to turn to their buddies, the Russians, and the Russians are going to see this as a prime opportunity to put IRBMs or intermediate range ballistic missiles into Cuba. And U-2 flights like this are going to find these things. And we're going to see things like that. And we're like, no, 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 no. Well, it's medium or MRBM, IRBM, same daggone thing. Anyway, at San Cristobal, we're going to find out, you know what? These people could attack America. And we ain't going to have that. And so the CIA and the Department of Defense begin to figure out, whoa, this can come all the way to Washington. If they have long-range missiles, it can go all the way to just about any part of the United States. We can't have that knife at our throat. And so the military gives different options. Curtis LeMay, whose nickname was Old Iron Ass during World War II, he's the man who was in charge of making sure the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan. Guess what he wants to do here? He wants to blow the place apart. He wants to use nuclear weapons if we need to. If the Soviets don't like it, we'll fight them as well. And it boils down to Kennedy, who had this deathly fear of looking weak in front of LBJ. He's almost ready to give in to these senior military advisors. But his brother Bobby calls him outside, and this picture was taken, and it's so poignant. And Bobby says, not yet. Give him a chance. So we institute a blockade and a quarantine. And anyway, a Russian ship runs the blockade, and we decide not to fire. I mean, it's a zoo. And for 13 days, America and the Soviet Union are staring down nuclear Armageddon. And it's JFK's cool head and the sound advice of Robert Kennedy that gets America through it. And there's an excellent thing that happens. One of them is their nuclear test ban treaty. Instead of testing these things in the atmosphere, they're just going to test them underground. Also, they're going to install, we call it a hotline. It's not like a bat phone when you pick it up and talk to the Russians. It's actually a computer terminal, and you type back and forth, but there's going to be a direct link between Washington and Moscow. We're not going to test these godforsaken bombs in the atmosphere anymore. I mean, look at this. This is an itty-bitty one. You can carry a bomb that will make that kind of explosion inside my computer bag now. Literally, man-portable. But you look at it, 0.16 seconds, and it looks like some of the scrubbing bubbles off of that old TV commercial. That's how it compresses the atmosphere. And you look at the cancer death in America, at least 15,000. Probably a lot more, but nobody's going to admit it. This stuff is rough. We don't need it in the atmosphere. You think the corona's bad. Good gosh almighty. And every one of us alive today has the effects of this in us. Strontium-90, cesium-137 are in our bodies as a result of these tests. But Kennedy's also going to have another side. We have the Peace Corps and the Alliance for Progress. We want to help these other countries in meeting their needs. And we're going to send some of our best and brightest to do that. Because not only do we help them have a better life, it actually helps them see and have a better understanding of America, which is always a good thing. And so that's great. So the Peace Corps is still around to this day. Have students. It's actually paid off for student loans doing that. But you're going to help them with agriculture, help them with farming, agriculture, education, industry, getting drinkable water. I mean, it is a great thing, and that's under the Kennedy administration. But Kennedy's also going to go to the Berlin Wall in June of '61. All of a sudden now the Russians and their East German lackeys are going to erect a wall in East Berlin to keep people from coming to the American side because they kept trying to escape. And so he gets there, stands in front of the wall and says, "Ich bin ein Berliner." He says, "I'm a Berliner." Or at least I think that's what he was supposed to say. There's all this, he really said I'm a jelly donut, and all this other foolishness that goes on. But there's that wall. It isn't just a wall. It is a concrete block, barbed wire. It is a nasty thing. And you get families that are separated on either side. And you could see over, but you couldn't get there. You risk being shot. There's a picture of Kennedy there at the wall. This is some magazine website and kind of making a little sport of it. But you see the Cold War is deepening. Berlin Wall, Cuban Missile Crisis, Bay of Pigs. It's a mess. But then Kennedy goes to Dallas, and he's got to go there, the home state of his vice president. He's going there politically. He's going to meet with the Governor Connolly, and he's going to ride down the street through Dealey Plaza. And as he does, as he passes that grassy knoll, he gets shot from the Texas School Book Depository building. And I think we all know who it is, Lee Harvey Oswald. I don't know why I just did that. But the bullet that's recovered is that one right there. And I've done enough shooting in my life. I grew up hunting and shooting. Still, that bullet, that didn't get fired into anybody's body. I'm sorry, but who knows if that's the actual one? Who knows? So what happens is here the assassin and the assassin's killer. There's Lee Harvey Oswald, a disaffected American Marine who had went to the Soviet Union at some point in time. And there's old Jack Ruby who's going to shoot him in the Dallas police station. And so now the whole story is never going to be known. Seinfeld did an excellent parody of this back in the 90s. And if you go to that site right there, it's the Magic Loogie. It is an absolute wonderful thing, a deconstruction of history. It is so fun. Anyway, but here's Abraham Zapruder happened to be in Dealey Plaza filming, Kennedy coming through town. It's pretty cool when the president. And so this is his film, shot in 16 millimeter. And I want you to watch Kennedy. Oh, he has just been shot. And he laid down. His wife Jackie said what was going on, and then he gets shot a second time. And there she is helping the Secret Service agent into the car. And if you were in my class, this thing runs on a loop. If we're actually physically in class, it runs on a loop. I can't figure out how to make it do it here. But it's interesting to see, you just saw the President of the United States killed. And so that ends the JFK administration and the first part of the 1960s. As you can see, it started with so much promise and so much glamour, and it ends with a massive head wound to the president in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas in November of 1963.